Traditional man either ignored or considered absurd the idea that one could talk about laws and the obedience due them if the laws in question had a mere human origin, whether individual or collective. Once the divine character of a law was sanctioned and its origin traced back to a non-human tradition, then its authority became absolute. This law then became something ineffable, inflexible, immutable, and beyond criticism. Thus, every transgression of such law was regarded not so much as a crime against society, but rather and foremost as sacrilege or as an act of impiety, or as an act that jeopardized the spiritual destiny of the person who disobeyed it, as well as of the people with whom that person was socially related. This is why, up to and including medieval civilization, rebellion against authority and the imperial law was considered as serious a crime as religious heresy. Thus, the rebels were considered just like heretics, as enemies of their own natures. The idea that the state derives its origin from the demos or masses, and that the principle of its legitimacy and its foundation rests upon it is an ideological perversion typical of the modern world and essentially represents a regression. Once this direction was taken, an inevitable downward spiraling occurred, which ended with the triumph of the collectivistic world of the masses and with the advent of radical democracy. In addition to the four major castes, the Indo-Aryan tradition knew a broader and more significant distinction that points to the duality of natures. I am referring to the distinction between the Arya and the Sudra. The former were the nobles, or twice-born, who represented the divine element, Daiva. The latter were beings who belonged to nature, and thus who represented the promiscuous substratum of the hierarchy that was gradually overcome by the formative influence exercised within the higher castes, from the heads of the households to the Brahmana. Strictly speaking, this influence was the original meaning of the state and of the law within the world of tradition. It had a meaning of supernatural formation. These premises are the foundation upon which the potential affinity between the principle of every state and that of universality is founded. The dimension of that which is universal may appear in different aspects and different degrees in various civilizations and traditional organizations. The formative process always encounters resistance from matter, which acts in a differentiating and particularistic sense. Nevertheless, there is no form of traditional organization which, despite any local characteristics, any empirical exclusivism, any autocaphonicism of the cults and institutions it jealously defends, that does not hide a higher principle. Once in a while, it is possible to detect in certain historical institutions, such as monarchies and empires, an esoteric and universal core that transcends the specific geographical and historical dimensions of said institutions, culminating in a unity of a higher kind. Such are the imperial peaks of the world of tradition. Thus, while the ancient Chinese Empire was called the Middle Empire, and the seat of the world, according to Nordic legends, was called Midgard, the middle abode or center of the world, the capital of the Inca's Solar Empire was called Cusco, or navel of the world. Generally speaking, in prehistoric times, the symbolism of sacred stones points to the same order of ideas. The omphalos, or sacred stone, is not a naive representation of the shape of the world. Its meaning in Greek, navel, brings it back to the idea of a center, of a stable point, and it can also be related to what may be called sacred geography. We have seen that the opposition between the higher castes and the inferior caste of the Sudra was considered by the Indo-Aryans as an opposition between the divine and the demonic element. In Iran, the higher castes were believed to correspond to emanations of the heavenly fire descended to earth. On the one hand, there is the Ashavan, the pure, the faithful on earth and the blessed in heaven. On the other hand, opposed to the Ashavan are the Anashavan, the impure ones, those without law, or those who oppose the principle of light. In this context, the empire as a traditional system, governed by the King of Kings, corresponds to what the principle of light has successfully snatched from the snares of the principle of darkness. The limit of the empire is illustrated by the myth of the hero Shaoshan, the universal lord of a future, complete, and victorious kingdom of peace. A similar idea is found in the legend, according to which the Emperor Alexander the Great contained the onslaught of the peoples of Gog and Magog by building an iron wall. These people may represent in this context the demonic element that in the traditional hierarchies was successfully subjugated. One day, these people will flood the earth in pursuit of conquest, but they will ultimately be challenged by figures who, according to medieval sagas, will embody the archetype of the leaders of the Holy Roman Empire. A similar idea is expressed in some Nordic traditions with the image of the bulwarks that protect the middle abode from the elementary powers, and that one day will be overpowered during the twilight of the gods, the Ragnarok. The relationship between Aeternitas and Imperium is also found in the Roman tradition, hence the transcendent, non-human character with which the notion of rigere is associated. The world will not end as long as the Roman Empire existed. In relation to this theme, the Byzantine continuation of the Roman ideal acquires a particular meaning owing to the markedly theological and eschatological nature animating that ideal. The empire, which is conceived as an image of the heavenly kingdom, is willed and preordained by God. In the empire, the earthly sovereign is himself an image of the Lord of the universe. As the Lord himself, the sovereign is alone and without a second. He presides over both the temporal and spiritual domains, and his formal right is universal. The ideal of the empire re-emerged one more time in the Ghibelline Middle Ages with the same meta-historical content, that is, as a supernatural, universal institution created by Providence in order to straighten the fallen human nature and direct people to eternal salvation. This ideal was for all practical purposes paralyzed both by the Church and by historical circumstances, which precluded its comprehension as well as its effective realization according to its higher meaning. Dante, for instance, from a traditional point of view, was correct in claiming for the empire the same origins and supernatural destiny of the Church. He was correct in talking about the emperor as one who, owning everything and no longer wishing for anything else, is free of desire and who can therefore allow peace and justice to reign, and thus strengthens the active life of his subjects. After the original sin, this life can no longer resist the seductions of Cupiditas unless a higher power controls it and directs it. A political, economic, and social order created merely for the sake of temporal life is exclusively characteristic of the modern world. Laws and institutions, as in the case of all traditional civilizations, were both from above and oriented upwards. Traditionally, the state had a transcendent meaning and purpose that were not inferior to the ones the Catholic Church claimed for itself in the West, as a manifestation of and a path to the world above. With the Hohenstaufen dynasty, tradition had a last bright flicker. Eventually, the empires would be replaced by imperialism, and the state would be understood only as a temporal, national, particularistic, social, and plebeian organization.